Well, there's a natural disaster going on in the background outside with trees blowing down everywhere, but our priorities are straight and we are going to actually reveal our hidden blades to you and talk about Assassin's Creed. Now, while normally taking my hidden blade out lands me on a list that people can search online, luckily today we're talking about a fun list. The 5 settings we want to see for Assassin's Creed going forward. Now, these are story pitches. Obviously, we are not video game developers. Nate's here with me today, and we're going to be talking about this, so I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content as Nate gives you his top 5 favorite facts about George Washington's teethless mouth. Number 5. So the first setting that we want to see is World War I. Now, this is something that could be done very easily because there actually is a gameplay precedent and a story precedent for this, which is Lydia Fry. However, she didn't get a full game. Lydia Fry is actually Jacob Fry's granddaughter and the grandniece of Evie Fry. Because of her surname, she is often confused with the creator of French fries, Sir Charles Arthurian McBig Mac Pounder. But she is not related to him. And actually, she was an assassin during World War I. You're able to play as her in certain missions in Syndicate. I don't know if I actually have footage of this because I don't have much footage of Syndicate right now, and I'm replaying through all the games to actually get footage, so we'll see what I have. But it's interesting that this character never got a full game set during what was probably one of history's most interesting conflicts. It was essentially seen as almost an Armageddon war. This was at the time the war to end all wars. It was a huge deal. And it's really cool to see her during those missions, but we don't get to actually see her in a full game.
Yeah, and she's such a cool character too. Like in Syndicate, there's the portal mission. You can go through like this portal and you can play as Lydia Fry. Well, she meets cool characters like Winston Churchill, which I think is like a young Winston Churchill, which I think is kind of cool. But yeah, it takes place in London during World War One, and you get to have cool missions where you can like interact with like a artillery cannon thing. I forgot what they're called off the top of my head. Shoot down like enemy planes and stuff like that. It's pretty fun. But I've always thought that was a good setting for another game. You could have like an assassin assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Mm-hmm. You could have, just a lot of different cool things going on in the world. Did you just get my joke now?
I did. It took me a second. Plus, this is a story that could take place wherever you want.
Right.
I know that she was in, obviously she was in England,
right.
London, during this time period, but that doesn't mean she was there during all of World War I, and World War I's a long war.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different places you could take this. Maybe you have some of it in London, some of it somewhere else, or maybe you don't want it in London because of Syndicate. Maybe you want to set this somewhere else. There's plenty of fronts in the war, or even just different cities where you could have this take place in different countries. I mean, if you think about it, during the looming threat of World War I would also be very interesting as well. Like, it's happening, but maybe you're not necessarily taking part in all the battles. I know that it's hard because Connor in something like AC3, he takes place directly in certain conflicts in the Revolutionary War, and that's a cool idea. But you could kind of go a mixture. Maybe Lydia is involved in certain conflicts, but maybe it's also something similar to the Crusades in Assassin's Creed 1, where Altair is more hearing about it going on. He's not out there participating.
Right.
So I think that you could kind of go both ways on that and do whatever you want. It's a very open time period. I don't know. I've always really liked World War I, and I think that the general historical vibe during this time period is actually really depressing.
Yeah.
But it's also very insightful into human nature and stuff as well. If you look at some of the literature coming out of this time period as well, especially things with T.S. Eliot and other stuff going on with the modernist / postmodernist Enlightenment period of literature and philosophy. There's a lot of stuff that you could tie into the world and the general vibe of human beings during this time. People were actually very, very depressed, and people coming back from the front lines of the war, either injured or shipped back in a body bag or whatever. I mean, as horrible as it is, there was a lot of societal stuff going on with that, especially in how humans related to each other. So I think it would be really interesting to see what's going on with the assassins during this time period.
Yeah.
Because the assassins like to pretend that they are removed from history.
They're not.
They're not. They are directly involved in and affected by it. I know that they want to be removed from it, and they want to preserve freedom and just sort of allow people to make their own decisions, but most of the main assassins we've come to know and love throughout this series have been directly involved in and tied into these time periods, and how would she be directly involved in that is kind of my question that I'd love to play a game with. Number 4. It's the 4th one.
4.
The next one I want to see is actually sort of a roundabout sequel to Assassin's Creed 3. Now hold on before you click off because you have a hate boner for Aiden Pierce and Connor.
I'm already off.
I understand a lot of people hate those two characters specifically from Ubisoft. I'm not talking about a Connor game.
Right.
Although he could show up in the game.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm talking about is a game during the American War of 1812. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on during this, and to sort of give you the background of how this would work, Connor, who's the protagonist from Assassin's Creed 3, he was actually married sometime during the 1780s to another Native American woman from a nearby tribe. So it's worth noting that Connor actually was ostracized from his own tribe during this time. He left them to join the Assassin Order and work with Achilles Davenport and learn how to strike out at the Templars and reestablish the colonial assassins after they were destroyed by Shay Cormac during the events of Assassin's Creed Rogue years earlier. But the interesting thing about this is that he did eventually get married and he had kids. He had actually, I believe, 2 daughters and a son.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his daughters, who I am going to be horrible at pronouncing her name, believe it is pronounced Yohinyot, but I could be completely wrong. It's a Native American name that Nate refused to look up. She actually had eagle vision.
Right.
And this was described during the stories in Assassin's Creed Reflections, which is a comic book continuing the continuity of different assassins. One of the interesting things with this character tying into Connor is that Connor was sort of pushed around a lot during the time period of the American Revolution. He actually worked with and for the revolutionists, the patriots, a lot in order to help them, including George Washington. But it's interesting because later on he would become ostracized from that movement a lot after he found out that Washington was actually the commanding officer in the British military who ordered an attack on Connor's village, which inevitably led to the death of his mother. Those two would later actually make up, Connor and Washington. I don't know if they ever really fully trusted each other again, but they did trust each other enough that during the events of Tyranny of King Washington, when Washington was plagued by nightmares from an apple of Eden he recovered, he did seek out Connor, and Connor helped him and also did call him his friend.
Right.
So there's a lot of character development with Connor that could be passed down as well to his daughter. And his daughter actually had a psychic ability to attach herself to animals and even see through them. She actually used an eagle to warn her father, Connor, of a wolf attack and prevent him from being injured during a hunting trip. So this is really an interesting seeming character to me that we never got to see. I think, Nate, you could talk a little bit more about the history of it, but it is interesting the age she would have been during 1812.
Yeah, she would have been fighting age, because I think she was born in, I think what we're guessing, like the late 1780s, something like that. It doesn't really say what age she was born at, or what year she was born at, I mean. So you kind of have to guess, really. But she would be in her late 20s.
Yeah.
Probably early 30s, somewhere around there. Which would be during the War of 1812. But I like your joke. The Revolutionary...
Well, yeah, so the thing with the War of 1812 is that I call this the Revolutionary War sequel. However, I'm also disappointed because I'm still waiting to complete the trilogy.
I just read that.
So I just don't get why they won't finish it.
Well, we should complete the trilogy.
We should just fight them one more time.
Why not?
Even if it's like on good terms,
right,
like as a good sport.
Right.
Let's just finish it up.
Just say, let us win.
Until Disney buys out the war and makes the sequel trilogy.
Right.
But Nate, what are your thoughts on the War of 1812?
So basically, the War of 1812 is like a really fascinating time period that I think a lot of people don't really know a lot about. They just know the name.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, the British and the French were already like in the process of fighting wars. Like they had just gone through like the Napoleonic Wars and stuff like that. So they were like actively battling each other. And America kind of got caught in the middle of this. This was under the President Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States. A lot of the ships, because basically the British set this law that said, well, any neutral ships that come into our ports, we can search them, and we can make sure that they're not helping out the French. And then the French were like, well, any ships that were searched by the British, we're going to capture or destroy. Like, they both just made these laws that basically allowed them to hijack neutral countries' ships.
Right, they were making countries, in a way, side with them.
Right.
It's sort of similar to the World War I trade disputes.
Yeah.
Where it was like, hey, no, you're not going to trade with Italy, you're going to trade with us. Otherwise, if we catch you trading with Italy, we're not trading with you. Kind of that sort of thing. That's really interesting, because it sort of forced the hand of countries under them in power. Which America still is under them in power
at this point in time. They definitely were.
Yeah.
And then they were kind of caught in the middle, and in 1807, the U.S. ship, the Chesapeake, was actually blown up. And then over the next couple of years, more U.S. ships were captured or blown up, which caused eventually James Madison, the president after Jefferson, to declare war on the British, who, interestingly enough, had forts in Canada at the time, with troops in the forts. So this war basically was... I kind of see the capturing and destroying of ships as like an excuse to go to war, because almost immediately the Americans invaded Canada. Like, to the
As
forts.
they should.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
But there was also, like, interesting things of, like, Native Americans fighting the Americans at the time, because the Americans were also expanding west. And there was reports of the British actually riling up the Native Americans to attack them. So you have, like, the Native American Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet, who was battling William Henry Harrison at Prophetstown and stuff like that. So you had like different Native American conflicts going on as well.
And the British were sort of using that.
Right. Well, allegedly.
Allegedly. But it is worth noting, though, during this time period that the Americans were sick of the British.
Right.
Because the Americans viewed the British, this is from an American point of view in our history, the Americans sort of viewed the British as the big brother that they kicked out of the house,
right,
who was still waiting to come back.
Yeah, because they were just sitting up there.
Right, and they left troops purposely in those forts.
Right.
And so the American perception of this was, the British are just waiting for our government to fail so they can swoop in and attack us again,
right,
and take back the states and take them back for England.
Right.
So the Americans were very hesitant of the British. It's not like today where we're close-knit allies.
No.
There was no trust there.
Yeah, it wouldn't be till many years later that they would become allies again. But yeah, so anyways, I think it's kind of interesting. And then it kind of backfired on the Americans because the British ended up with their ragtag army here, because keep in mind, they're also fighting the French. They ended up just invading America and literally destroyed the White House. Now, this is not the White House that we know today. This would have been because it got destroyed. But they literally destroyed the Capitol, where you had a famous image of, but James Madison with his Secretary of War, James Monroe, who'd be president after him, standing on a hill outside of D.C., like watching D.C. burn.
Right.
Because, like, their capitals got taken over. So, and then they would actually go into hiding for a little bit and then eventually come back once the British left. But
and here's the question with all of this that it kind of points to is, we see a little bit of Connor's daughter in Assassin's Creed Reflections.
Right.
Obviously, and we know she's probably about 10, meaning, like you said, probably late 20s to early 30s. How would she feel about all this?
Right.
You know, you have her dad who believed strongly in independence for the country, but the independence that he fought for the country as a Native American, becoming an assassin that was sort of a neutral party between the two, ended up costing his tribe their land.
Right.
It ended up costing a lot of Native American lives. And so then it makes me wonder, would his daughter feel the same way? Would she be a little sympathetic towards the British, or would she, what would her feelings be?
Or would she be sympathetic towards Tecumseh and the other Native Americans out west?
Right, that's an interesting question. So there's like a lot of stuff you could do with that, and then how does her experience as an assassin, who's supposed to be a little bit more removed from this and not as biased, emotionally clinging to whatever side is closer to her, how would that actually interact with this time period? Plus, you also have the fact that you have more established American infrastructure on every level,
Right.
but not by a lot, a few decades worth. So you have a better economy here that's like a little more stable. You have early American philosophies that are about independence and freedom and all this stuff that sort of cropped up during and after the Revolutionary War, and sort of how that happened. I mean, I could even see I don't know what you'd say, a mission, I guess a story part, where you could be seeing what happened to the Capitol, stuff like that.
Right.
You could do really powerful moments like that and how those interact with this character. Plus, I mean, it's just an interesting way to do it versus just picking a, normal old random assassin that we've never met before. This character has previous ties to a character that we had before, so it would not only expand on his story, Connor's, but it would also build up his lineage. And I think it would do something that these games have a little bit of a problem with outside of a few entries, which is actually connecting the time periods.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times they just kind of jump around, but it'd be interesting to see that middle ground for me.
Yeah, I think it would be pretty fascinating. I think there's a lot you can do with this. I like the idea you've had of a story mission where you're in the Capitol. Like, there's no reason why his daughter can't be in the Capitol itself, like, as it's being overrun. Like, maybe she's trying to defend it or something, but maybe she doesn't do it too well, or I don't
she's
know.
taking pictures with the police there, and
Right.
and then you flash forward
And
to
maybe
the modern assassin.
Maybe it happens to take place in January.
And you
I don't
flash
know.
forward to a modern assassin,
Right.
like today, on the 6th, I don't know.
Right.
There is a lot of cool stuff, though, that you could do with it, jokes aside, that I think are really fascinating. And I think that this is a war that people don't talk about that
Right.
much. The War of 1812 is kind of seen, again, like memes aside, as like the kind of less interesting sequel war to the Revolutionary War, or like the epilogue to it. But there's a lot more going on there, especially in American history. This was actually a time of immense pain for America.
Right.
To see their capital burned and to see... Now, am I saying that they didn't somewhat, poke the bear? No.
Right.
But I'm saying that it still did heavily affect American morale and the history of that time period.
Yeah.
Number three. So the next one we have is actually based off of a character that's mentioned in Assassin's Creed 3 specifically, but is not really related to it. That's actually Jean de la Tour, who is a French-Canadian assassin. And I would say that this game could take place before and during the Austrian War of Succession, which actually affected both America and Canada as well. There's a lot of stuff to this that I think, Nate, maybe you can describe a little better than me, because it is a complicated point in history, but it ties very well into things like the establishment of the colonial Brotherhood of Assassins, and then the events of Rogue and the events of 3.
Yeah, John is mentioned in 3, like you said. You can get his outfit. And his outfit says, the first assassin of the American colonies. But I think that's important to think about, because he's not the first assassin to visit the New World.
Right.
He's just the first assassin of the American colonies. So I think it more has to do with like the British colonies. But basically, he works with a young Achilles, Davenport, in 1740. And the two of them kind of had this weird dynamic where maybe they didn't really like each other that much, but they respect each other. And then in A.C. Rogue's War Letters, you actually learn that John goes on at the Battle of the Louisbourg Fort in north of Nova Scotia. Him and Achilles are there actually defending the fort because it's being attacked. And he sacrifices himself so that Achilles and Achilles' wife, Abigail, can get away from the fort. They escape. Now, why that's important is because Achilles would then go to the Americas, like the States, or what would become the States, and he would actually establish or help establish the colonial branch of the Assassins. So, for me, this John de la Tour guy, who's not really mentioned that much in the Assassin world or whatever, to me, he's like one of the most important characters.
Yeah.
At least in the American branches of the Assassins, because if he didn't sacrifice himself there, Achilles would be dead, And Achilles would never have established the colonial branch of the Assassins.
And he never would have taken Connor in as a son,
Right.
basically as a surrogate son,
Yeah.
and taught him the ways of being an assassin, and then Connor would have never rebuilt the assassin order there, which, by the way, directly leads to the events of even things like the modern day assassin influence in America. That wouldn't exist without Jean de la Tour.
Mm-hmm.
At least it wouldn't exist on the level that it was at, because the Templars were actually at a point in Assassin's Creed 3 where without Connor, they were actively going to establish a strong foothold in America. They saw it as a new world. They saw it as a new opportunity, untarnished by all of the history around it, to start over, to get the Templar Order in charge of an entire nation.
Right.
That was a huge deal. They had Charles Lee, who they had actually propped up to be the head of the Revolutionary Army. They supported revolutionary independence, which Connor didn't understand at first. He thought that they had sided with the British, but they actually also wanted independence. It's just that they wanted independence that the Templars were in charge of. So there's a lot of stuff that would have happened here without Jean de la Tour.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of fascinating in of itself. Also, I do want to mention, a lot of people confuse, though, the colonial assassins with the assassins of the Caribbean.
Right. They're two separate things.
Yeah, they're still both assassins, but they're different branches. Because
Right.
I think a lot of people, myself included, back before I knew more about the lore, not that I'm the expert.
Right. Back before you were the expert.
Right, exactly. Before I became
Baron Trump.
Jabraham Ubisoft.
Okay.
Before I became him, I actually thought that, oh, well, Edward was a member of the American Assassins,
Right.
or what would become the American Assassins. But it's not true. That branch, the Caribbean Assassins, are separate but equal. They're separate
Nice.
but connected.
Nice.
You know.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot you can do here. Like, obviously, John de la Tour dies in 1745 when this Louisbourg fort is being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously, the game would have to end in 1745, or at least most of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a lot you can do with leading up to that. Like, you can have them being in, like, a pre-Assassin's Creed 3 or even Assassin's Creed Rogue Americas, and helping to establish more of like the Canada side of the Americas, which is not really a region that was explored that much. I mean, it was a little bit in Rogue, but it wasn't really Canada.
No, they more just talk about it a little bit. Or in
Right,
Assassin's Creed.
you can go into Canada and Rogue in a certain mission set.
But in 3, like, they really just kind of talk about it. And you can send your assassins up there and they'll tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
But they act like, no, it's not that important, even though it technically is.
Right.
Especially to that region, especially with the War of 1812 and all those events that would eventually happen.
Right.
Canada did have a big impact on the Americas. I don't know. I think that there's a lot you could do with it, like you said, and I think that this actually helps expand stories of previous assassins again. It's not just Connor, by the way. I know that somebody's gonna read into this and think like, you just want to expand Connor's story. No, I want to know more about Achilles.
Right.
What's going on with Achilles? This is a very interesting character. This is a black assassin during a time where black people were treated like garbage, especially in America. And he was basically built up by Jean de la Tour to be the mentor and master of the colonial assassins.
Right.
So how does he actually establish that? What's his journey like? You can end it. Sure, you can end it with the death of Jean de la Tour, or you could be close to the ending with the game with Jean de la Tour and play a few hours as Achilles after that in almost an epilogue setting building up. Or you could, I would say this would be the best way to do it, end with Jean de la Tour's death and then create DLC story expansions like they've done for Valhalla, Origins, etc.
Right.
As Achilles. Then you get to see him building up those assassins, because it's not just adding to Connor, it's also adding to Achilles, it's adding to the American Brotherhood of Assassins, it's adding to Shay Cormac. What are the events that built the Brotherhood that would eventually end in tragedy under Achilles with the first civilization earthquake, I guess I'll call it, that caused Shay Cormac to betray the Order and become a Templar. All of these events are actually very intricately connected, but we're missing pieces in the middle. We know kind of what happened, but we didn't get to experience it.
Yeah, I think that's why I think this would be probably one of the most interesting games they could ever make. Because you really do get to see the establishment of that branch. Which obviously Connor would then help to grow again.
And you're building off of Edward too.
Right.
You know, you're building off of the Caribbean assassins.
Edward could even appear in the... I don't know how he would, but you could have him in the game. You know? So I don't know. There's just a lot you can do here.
Number two. The numero dos. So Russia in the 1560s AD, obviously. Now this is interesting because this is during the Russian Empire's establishment. This is actually during Ivan the Terrible. He consolidated power in Russia during 1547. And for maybe those who don't know Russian history or need just a very tiny crash course reminder, Ivan the Terrible is actually very interesting because he was a very, very unstable guy. Yes, he did help bring Russia into the modern day of that time period, and really push the country forward under his rule. He actually did a lot for the Russian people that history appreciates him for, but he was a bit of a lunatic in a lot of ways. He actually in real life would go on to kill his own son, because he was actually, even though he was intelligent, he was actually described as paranoid, rageful, and he had episodic outbreaks of mental instability that got worse as he got older. So he actually killed his oldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, in anger, and actually the historians believe he might have also caused the miscarriage of his unborn child, Ivan Ivanovich's.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that this guy did. You mentioned to me that one historical idea or explanation for this is that he bathed in mercury, which affected his mental state.
Yeah, he thought... I can't remember if he thought it helped him stay young or if it helped his brain, you know, get better. Or what I don't remember what the exact reason was, but yeah, that's one explanation for his paranoia fits he would have and his rageful fits and stuff like that, is because the guy's brain was probably becoming mentally unstable.
Right.
I mean, the guy would literally take baths in mercury. And we're not talking just like have mercury sitting in a tub and he would sit in it. We're talking like they would be pouring it on his head. Like he would be fully enveloped in mercury.
It's a wonder he didn't go blind or something.
Yeah. I mean, so that is an explanation for this. I don't know if there's a lot of hard evidence for this. I mean, I'm hard right now, but I don't know if there's hard evidence.
Can you give me your hard evidence after
I can give you my hard evidence.
Thank you.
So, I don't know. I think this would be a very interesting time period because the establishment of the Russian Empire, or the Tsardom, was under Ivan the Terrible. Before him, you had like kings. You had like kings of like the Rus people, but you had like different groups of people in what is nowadays Russia. And Ivan the Terrible's dad was actually one of the kings in Moscow, and Ivan was the Grand Prince of Moscow. He, in 1547, when he was 16 years old, he actually crowned himself the Tsar of Russia. And he made, basically in his rule, he consolidated the power and united the people of Russia.
He turned it into one country.
Yeah, exactly. He turned it into different groups of people into one country. And he is the first Tsar of Russia. Now, he's not a Romanov Tsar, which is the famous Tsar of, line of Russia. But he was the first Tsar. So I think just having some of his life in there would be kind of interesting. And it even works in the Assassin's Creed world. Like we said, he murdered his son, Ivan Ivanovich. He murdered him. But you could explain that in the Assassin's Creed lore by saying, well, maybe his son was killed by the Russian Brotherhood of Assassins.
Which is what they do say in supplementary material, but we never get to experience it again. Kind of like what we talked about in previous entries.
Right. So, and maybe, and in this material, they said they discovered a connection between Ivan and the Templars. So basically, in the Assassin's Creed world, Ivan the Terrible's son is becoming involved with the Templars.
Yeah, and he is actually the set-up heir.
Right.
The apparent heir.
Right.
So the problem with that is that once he would become the next Tsar of Russia or the next Emperor of Russia, the Templars would have direct access to the top levels of Russian government.
Right.
So in order to prevent that, the assassins killed Ivanovich.
Right.
So it'd be interesting to sort of see an assassin sort of, I don't want to say growing up, but living in this time period. I don't think you'd start it in 1547.
Right.
That's a sort of slow time period of consolidating power and all this stuff. I think you start it, 13 to 15 years after that, when Ivan the Terrible is actually established and sort of lead it up to the death, or I'm sorry, when Ivan the Terrible is established and lead it up to the death of his son by the assassins, and sort of the events that pushed them there.
Right. Yeah, and it's also just a growing Russian world, because Russia does appear in later games, or I guess in the timeline history, a later game of Chronicles.
And in the comics.
Right. But Chronicles takes place during the Russian Revolution, which is in 1917. So we're talking like 400 years before this is what that would be, which I think would be kind of interesting. You can kind of see the start of the Russian Tsardom. Whereas in Chronicles, you're experiencing the end of the Russian Tsardom. So, I don't know. I just think this would be a very interesting world. Moscow is obviously a city, but it's not what it is today. You know, you can see, I think the Kremlin was built at the time. I'd have to look that one up.
The Kremlin was built at the time because the assassins, I believe, infiltrated the Kremlin at this time.
So yeah, the Kremlin would be there. You know, like other cool Moscow artifacts or whatever would be there. I don't know. I just think it's an interesting place. You might even be able to get
to see the legendary moss cow.
You might. That's like the cow filled with moss?
Yeah, well, no, built of moss. It's a legendary creature that we'll get to see on the mythical side of Assassin's Creed, like how you get to see the Kraken or the Headless Horseman.
Yeah.
The moss cow, honestly, I would see a whole game about it.
That would be kind of interesting.
And the furries would love it. Number 1!
Splat.
The final one we have is the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1520 to 1521. I had to try really hard. I'm not trying to be mean to anyone, but I gotta be honest with you. I had to really refrain from calling this Tenochtitlan. So, like, I reined it in for you on this list, and you should be thankful. But there's a lot of interesting stuff with this that ties into previous Assassin's Creed stories. Nate, I'm gonna let you cover a lot of the history on this, but I do want to mention one thing. Giovanni Borgia is actually taking place during this time period because he left his father Cesare Borgia, who you might remember from Assassin's Creed Brotherhood specifically, from the beginning of the game and I guess the majority of the game with the Borgia family. So he was actually saved by Francesco Vecchio, an apprentice of Ezio. So Giovanni Borgia was saved by an apprentice of Ezio, and eventually in 1515 he's brought to Ezio to be officially trained as an assassin in the Assassin's Brotherhood. This takes place 3 years after the end of Assassin's Creed Revelations, which is one of my favorite Assassin's Creed games of all time, and probably my favorite Ezio game. I love it. Now, Ezio would die in 1524 at the age of 65 from a heart attack during the events of Assassin's Creed Embers, but before that and after Revelations, in that time period, before he fully retired, he trained Giovanni Borgia, and then also after his retirement, I believe after, he would go on to train Xiao Jun, who would then tie into the Assassin's Creed Chronicles China story. So what's interesting about all of this is it doesn't only give us a look at a new assassin, Giovanni Borgia, who ties into previous villains and heroes of this of the universe, but also this is sort of kind of a spiritual successor to the Ezio trilogy. This is a way to actually tie Ezio into a game again, a fan favorite character, without making a 500th Ezio game.
Right.
You know, you don't need to make another DS spin-off or a sequel to Revelations or anything like that. He's had enough material, but wouldn't it be awesome to be this assassin training for a little while, maybe a couple hours in the story, under Ezio? You directly interact with him, maybe you go out on a few missions for him, and then it moves into the history, Nate, that you're going to talk about.
Yeah, so after Giovanni Borgia gets trained by Ezio, the Brotherhood actually orders him to infiltrate Hernan Cortez's expedition into the New World. Now, Hernan Cortez was a conquistador, a Spanish conquistador, who was basically traveling through the New World at this time, and he had ordered an expedition to actually discover what was there, try to get some of the rumored Aztec gold that was in the area, stuff like that. So, Hernan Cortez in the Assassin's Creed universe is not a Templar or an assassin. He's just a conquistador.
He's just a guy.
Right. But Giovanni Borgia is ordered to infiltrate his army to basically go to the New World and find a rumored piece of Eden that was at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Now, Tenoctitlan is pronounced some Aztec pronunciation. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I'm going to say Tenoctitlan.
Okay, 10 times Titlan.
Yeah, 10 times Titlan. But basically what's interesting is, while Giovanni is there, he witnesses the attack on the capital and their eventual destruction and capture in 1521 by Hernan Cortez. But he during the attack finds the piece of Eden, which is a crystal skull, and then you see Indiana Jones come in.
So you want this to tie into the best Indiana Jones
Yes, I do. Yes, that's what I'm getting
one.
So he finds a piece of Eden, kills the priest defending it, takes the piece of Eden, the crystal skull, back to Europe with him, where they can like analyze it and stuff like that. But I think this would be a very fascinating setting for an Assassin's Creed game because, one, you already have a great, interesting assassin here that ties in with Ezio, he ties in with the Borgia family, stuff like that. But two, this is just an interesting area too because, Hernan Cortez's expedition of this capital city is fascinating. You have the Aztec king Montezuma II, who's there, who, interestingly enough, turns down Hernan Cortez multiple times to come in and meet with him, but eventually accepts it after Cortez befriends a fellow person who lives in the area, and he teaches him the language, basically. And then he comes in, Montezuma accepts him, but then Cortez essentially betrays the trust of Montezuma, invades the city, gets pushed out of the city where he has to flee, basically calls on his reinforcements or whatever that are in the area. They invade the city again, and they watch as Montezuma II is killed in 1521. But there are reports of him being stoned by his own people, and there's also reports of him being killed by the Spanish. So it's kind of like, we don't know how he's killed.
So the assassins killed him.
Right, so I'm saying, like, there is some interesting stuff here. Like, you can easily explain it as, like, maybe Giovanni Borgia goes back and assassinates him.
Well, didn't you mention, too, that in the actual storyline, I don't remember exactly what it is in the lore, but that one of the expeditions also turned on Montezuma and the Aztecs in lore after witnessing like human sacrifices and other stuff? There was like some kind of cruelty thing.
Yeah, so in the Assassin's Creed world, this is not history, so I'm kind of interested in what the explanation for the difference is.
Right.
But I was reading about like the lore in Assassin's Creed, and they were at a festival of the Aztecs, right? Like Cortez was. And there is basically they saw a human sacrifice, which was a common Aztec practice, and a lot of the Spanish people were so appalled by this that essentially they started attacking the Aztecs, and then eventually like this massacre occurred, and then the
Night of Sorrow.
It was called the Night of Sorrow, where basically then the Aztecs were kind of confused because they had thought like, wait, our gods are attacking us. And then they finally realized, like, no, these are the Spanish people. And then they attacked them back. So I kind of think, like, maybe they were drunk or something. I don't know. But
right. Which was like common practice at most festivals throughout history.
So, I don't know. There's just a lot of interesting stuff you can do here. And then Cortez would eventually come back with more reinforcements, capture the city, like I said, and rename it to Mexico City, which is obviously what it is now.
I gotta be honest, it's a little more boring of a city name.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But there's actually parts in Mexico City where you can actually dig up old parts of the capital. It's interesting, yeah.
You can do that?
Well, they have archaeological expeditions
that
you can join.
Oh, okay. But and can you pocket the stuff?
No.
Okay.
But
speaking of this is a very off the cuff thing. Okay. We had a teacher in high school who went on a historical dig and stole a relic. Do you remember this? And he was proud of it.
He like snuck it out. Yeah, I remember that.
And he was like proud of how he stole this piece of history from the Middle East.
I remember that.
So anyway, maybe you could have like his descendants.
That would be cool.
Or his ancestors.
Like steal parts of history.
Steal history. That'd be awesome. From Tenoctitlan.
But yeah, I don't know. I think this would be interesting. There's just a lot you can do. It'd be like the world itself would obviously be very similar to 4, like Black Flag. with you being in the Caribbean.
But more tribal, I would say.
Right.
You know, you can have
yeah,
cities, I guess, but I know these were cities.
Right.
But I'm saying, like, you can have the more Spanish cities, too, outside of it, but you could also have the more tribal side of it as well.
Well, yeah, you can explore a lot of, like, the Aztec cities.
And wouldn't it be interesting to see, you know how you got to see the frontier in Assassin's Creed 3?
Yeah.
And you got to see sort of that same type of open setting in Assassin's Creed 4, where Edward's going around to different islands in different parts of the Caribbean. To be able to sort of see that again here in this new world, but also with established tribal identities and previous people groups existing there. I know we keep saying there's a lot you could do with this time period, about every time period, but sort of the sky is the limit because of how many different people groups you have interacting, how new this world is to the people, how new it would be to Giovanni, you know, and how he would be able to carry on that legacy and influence of Ezio and the assassins to that world. And also, would he have been involved, you know, not in the massacre, but in turning on the Aztecs,
right.
You know, seeing that when he's recovering the crystal skull, or would he remove himself from that situation and just go for the piece of Eden?
Yeah, or would he use the crystal skull to summon the UFO spaceship?
Oh, sorry.
And it actually bursts through this city and destroys it. I mean, we don't know.
I mean, would he hide in a fridge during a nuke? I don't know.
I would. He could.
I'd leave the fridge open at this point. I'm tired of suffering. But I don't know. I love these time periods we talked about. This is probably going to be one of our longer videos that I'll try and cut down a bit, but I love talking about these. I know we have at least one more in the tank that we want to do. It might not be the next Assassin's Creed top 5, but it's one we want to do, talking about 5 more time periods, because we already have 2 or 3 picked out. But all of these I love, and one of the common themes with all of these is that we want to see more established in the cracks, you know? Not just in my crack, but in the cracks of the story, because what's actually happening to the descendants of these assassins, or what's happening to their proteges and the people that they trained, how is that influence and story carried forward?
Right.
Instead of just jumping ahead 300 years at a time, seeing the next generation, whether they're related to them or not, like Giovanni for Ezio, or seeing Connor's daughter, where there's a direct relation. That would be great. I'd love to see that, and I think it would really humanize previous characters in the Assassin's Creed lore while also building up new ones. So, I don't know. These are kind of our thoughts. Let us know what you think in the comments down below. What of these time periods sounds really interesting to you? Maybe none of them do. Let us know. Do you have other time periods that you'd suggest? Or maybe are there time periods in the supplementary material, like comics, you know, Assassin's Creed Embers, movies like that you think would make good time periods? Maybe they'll make a list in the future. Interested to hear that? Have a fantastic day. Be sure to check out the description and the links in the description down below to our secondary channel, Degenerate Plays. We're playing through some Assassin's Creed games there and other stuff. And as always, everybody, stay shway. Also, a big thank you to some of our Patreon supporters who are helping us keep the lights on and keep going and making high quality content. We appreciate you guys very, very much. I'm going to show the names on the screen today because I took 5 takes and butchered them. But I will say, if you are interested in checking out the Patreon, where you have access to almost 100 exclusive videos that are not seen anywhere else, and also get to know and rest easy with the feeling in your heart knowing that you are helping support this channel and Degenerate Plays. More information will be available on the Patreon, which is linked in the description down below. I hope you'll check that out. Have a fantastic day, everyone, and as always, stay shway.